In Millbrook, California, a Purple Heart recipient was about to face his most humiliating battle on home soil. What started as a routine grocery run took a shocking turn when he came face to face with illegal discrimination. Peter Anderson wasn't your typical veteran. For 20 years, he had served as a Marine, known for leading men through Afghanistan's deadliest missions. When he encountered the store owner banning his service dog Ranger, he had no idea he was walking into a viral firestorm. Peter's quiet acceptance triggered his daughter's TikTok video that would lead to his scattered Marine unit converging on the small town. What began as discrimination would become a brotherhood reunion that changed everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning ritual never changed. Peter Anderson's alarm went off at 0600 hours. Old habits die hard. And within minutes, Ranger was at his bedside, the German shepherd's intelligent brown eyes already alert and focused. The dog knew the routine, as well as Peter did, perhaps better. While Peter worked through the careful process of getting his damaged left leg functional enough for the day ahead, Ranger waited with the patience that only came from rigorous training and unwavering loyalty. "Morning, boy," Peter murmured, running his fingers through Ranger's thick coat. The simple contact grounded him, pulled him back from the edge of the nightmare that had woken him 20 minutes before the alarm. Afghanistan, the IED, Martinez, and Johnson, who hadn't made it home. The dreams never left entirely, but Ranger's presence made them manageable. The dog's tail wagged once, a measured response that spoke of his training. Ranger wasn't a pet, he was a lifeline. 3 years of specialized work had taught the shepherd to recognize the subtle signs of Peter's PTSD episodes, to provide mobility assistance when the shrapnel in Peter's leg flared up, and to create the space Peter needed when the world closed. In too tight. By 0800, they were ready for their weekly grocery run to Henderson's. Peter preferred the early hour when the store was less crowded, when he could navigate the aisles without too many stares or well-meaning questions about his service. Millbrook was a small coastal town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and Peter had learned that his Purple Heart and medical discharge made him something of a local curiosity. The morning fog hung low over the Pacific as Peter guided his modified pickup into Henderson's parking lot. Ranger sat alert in the passenger, a seat, his service vest clearly visible, bright blue with reflective patches that read, "Service dog, do not pet, working." Peter had learned the hard way that without the vest, people assumed Ranger was just another pet, and the questions would start. "Heel," Peter commanded softly as they approached the store's automatic doors. Ranger fell into position at Peter's left side, matching his pace perfectly, compensating for the slight hitch in Peter's gait that still lingered from the explosion that had changed everything. Margaret Henderson looked up from behind the customer service counter as they entered. Peter had shopped here for 3 years since moving to Millbrook, but the woman's expression suggested she was seeing him for the first time. Her lips pressed into a thin line as her gaze moved from Peter to Ranger and back again. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying across the relatively quiet store. "Sir, you can't bring that animal in here." Peter stopped, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest that preceded the bad moments. "He's a service dog, ma'am. He's legally allowed." "I don't care what kind of dog he is," Margaret interrupted, stepping out from behind the counter. "This is a food establishment. We have health codes to follow." The words hit Peter like a physical blow. Around them, other customers had begun to notice the confrontation. An elderly woman with a cart full of produce paused to stare. A young father pulled his daughter closer, eyeing Ranger as if the dog might suddenly become dangerous. "Ma'am, service dogs are specifically exempt from those regulations," Peter said, his voice carefully controlled. 20 years in the Marines had taught him to keep his tone level even when everything inside him was screaming. The Americans with Disabilities Act. I don't know anything about that, Margaret cut him off again. All I know is we can't have animals where there's food. It's basic hygiene. Brandon Henderson, Margaret's son, emerged from one of the aisles with a price gun in his hand. Peter had seen the young man before, always polite, always professional. Now Brandon looked between his mother and Peter with obvious discomfort. "Mom," Brandon said quietly, "I think he might be right about the law." "Brandon, please handle." "The inventory," Margaret's voice brooked no argument. "I'll deal with this." The dismissal of her own son, the way she said "this" while looking directly at Peter, sent a surge of heat through his chest. Ranger pressed closer to his leg, sensing the change in Peter's breathing, the subtle shift in his posture that meant trouble was coming. Peter's vision began to narrow at the edges. The fluorescent light seemed too bright. The murmur of other customers became a roar that reminded him of helicopters and gunfire. He was losing it, right here in front of everyone, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do to stop it. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," Margaret was saying, but her voice sounded distant now, filtered through the fog of memory and trauma that was pulling Peter under. Ranger did what he was trained to do. The dog moved to block Peter's path to the door, creating a barrier that forced Peter to stop and focus. The weight of Ranger's body against his leg, the familiar texture of the dog's fur under his fingers, these anchored him, pulled him back from the edge of complete dissociation. But the damage was done. Every eye in the store was on them now. Peter could feel the stares, the whispers, the judgment of people who saw a broken veteran making a scene over a dog. His dignity, already fragile after years of struggling to find. His place in civilian life crumbled completely. "Come on, Ranger," he said quietly, turning toward the door. "We're not wanted here." The walk to his truck felt endless. Behind him, he could hear Margaret explaining to someone that she had to maintain standards, that she couldn't just let anyone bring animals into her store. The words followed him across the parking lot like stones thrown at his back. Inside the truck, Peter sat gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. Ranger placed a paw on his arm. Another trained response, a way of grounding him when the world became too much. But today, even Ranger's presence couldn't stop the shame from burning through him. He drove home through the fog, taking the long way to avoid passing the store again. By the time he pulled into his driveway, he had convinced himself he could handle this quietly, the way he handled everything else. Sarah didn't need to know. No one needed to know. But Sarah was waiting on the porch when he got out of the truck, her laptop balanced on her knees, probably working on some project for her communications program at UC Santa Barbara. At 21, she had her mother's quick mind and her father's stubborn streak, a combination that had served her well in college, but sometimes made their relationship complicated. "Back already?" she asked, looking up from her screen. "Forget something?" Peter shook his head, not trusting himself to speak, but Sarah knew him too well. She'd grown up watching him fight battles that no one else could see, learning to read the signs of his struggles the way Ranger had been trained to do. "Dad." Her voice went soft, concerned. "What happened?" "Nothing," Peter said automatically. "Just, they didn't have what I needed." Sarah's eyes moved to the empty reusable bags in his hands, then to his face, reading the truth there with the kind of clarity that made him both proud and frustrated. She closed the laptop and stood up, her expression shifting from concern to something much more dangerous. "Tell me what really happened." And despite every instinct that told him to keep it private, to handle it himself the way Marines were supposed to handle things, Peter found himself telling her everything. The words came out flat and mechanical, like he was filing a report. But Sarah heard what lay beneath them. When he finished, the silence stretched between them for a long moment. Then Sarah's jaw tightened in a way that reminded Peter powerfully of her mother. "They can't do that," she said quietly. "They absolutely cannot do that to you." Peter started to tell her it didn't matter, that he could shop somewhere else, that it wasn't worth making a fuss over. But the look in his daughter's eyes stopped him cold. Sarah had inherited more than just her mother's intelligence. She had also inherited a sense of justice that burned bright and fierce, and Peter could see that fire kindling now. He had no idea that in a few hours that fire would spread, far beyond their small coastal town, reaching people he hadn't seen in years and setting in motion events that would change everything. Sarah's fingers flew across her phone screen with the kind of focused intensity Peter recognized from her childhood. The same look she'd worn when tackling math homework or building elaborate sandcastles that had to be architecturally sound. But this wasn't play. This was war, fought with pixels and hashtags instead of bullets and bombs. "What are you doing?" Peter asked, though part of him already knew and dreaded the answer. "What you should have done years ago," Sarah replied without looking up. "I'm telling the truth." She'd moved to her bedroom, claiming she needed better lighting, but Peter suspected she wanted privacy for whatever digital campaign she was mounting. He could hear her voice through the thin walls, practicing different versions of the same story, refining her message the way she'd been taught in her communications classes. Peter tried to distract himself with the newspaper, but the words blurred together. The morning's humiliation played on repeat in his mind. Margaret Henderson's dismissive tone, the stares of other customers, the way Brandon had looked at him with what might have been pity. 20 years of military service, 3 tours in Afghanistan, a Purple Heart for wounds received in defense of his country, and he'd been thrown out of a grocery store like some vagrant who'd wandered in off the street. Ranger sensed his agitation and moved closer, the dog's warm weight against his leg, a familiar comfort. But even Ranger couldn't chase away the feeling that he'd somehow failed again, that his inability to stand up for himself had let down everyone who mattered. "Dad, can you come here for a second?" Sarah's voice carried a note he'd learned to recognize, the carefully neutral tone she used when she was about to ask him to do something he wouldn't want to do. Peter found her sitting cross-legged on her bed, phone propped up against a stack of textbooks, ring light casting a soft glow across her face. "I want to get this right," she said. "Tell me again exactly what happened at Henderson's, every detail." "Sarah, I don't want—" "Please." The word stopped him cold. Sarah rarely said please for anything, too stubborn and independent to beg. "This isn't just about you anymore. Do you know how many veterans are probably dealing with this same kind of discrimination? How many people with service dogs get turned away because store owners don't know the law or don't care?" Peter looked at his daughter, really looked at her. When had she grown up so much? When had she developed this fierce sense of justice that reminded him so powerfully of Elena? His ex-wife had possessed the same kind of righteous anger, the same inability to let injustice slide by unchallenged. It had been one of the things he'd loved most about her, until his own darkness had driven her away. "The video's already recorded," Sarah continued, interpreting his silence as resistance. "I can post it with or without your input, but I'd rather have it be accurate." So Peter told the story again, this time with all the details he'd initially glossed over. Sarah listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification, building a complete picture of the morning's events. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Okay," she said finally. "I'm going to post this now. It'll probably just get a few dozen views, maybe a couple hundred if we're lucky, but it's better than doing nothing." Peter wanted to stop her. Every instinct trained into him by 2 decades of military service screamed that this was wrong, that personal problems should be handled privately, that airing grievances in public was undisciplined and unmilitary. But he also knew that look in his daughter's eyes. Sarah had made up her mind, and trying to change it would be like trying to redirect a hurricane. "Just be fair," he said finally. "Margaret Henderson isn't evil. She's just ignorant." Sarah's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "I'll be completely fair, Dad. I'll stick to the facts. But facts can be pretty damning all by themselves." She posted the video at 2:17 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. Peter went outside to work in his small garden, trying to lose himself in the simple task of tending his tomato plants. Ranger sprawled in the shade nearby, watching Peter with the patient attention that had gotten him through countless therapy sessions. The first sign that something was happening came when Sarah's phone started buzzing with notifications. At first, it was just a few comments and likes. Friends from college expressing outrage, a few strangers sharing similar experiences. But social media algorithms are designed to amplify emotion, and righteous anger is one of the most potent emotions of all. By 4 p.m., the video had broken 1,000 views. By 6 p.m., it had hit 10,000. Local Millbrook residents began recognizing Henderson's grocery in the background shots Sarah had included, and the comment section became a battleground between those supporting Peter and those defending Margaret Henderson as a pillar of the business community. Sarah found Peter in the garden as the sun was setting, her face flushed with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. "Dad, you need to see this," she said, holding up her phone. It's way bigger than I expected." The numbers were staggering. 50,000 views and climbing. Hundreds of comments from veterans sharing their own stories of discrimination. Disability rights advocates sharing the video across multiple platforms. Military families expressing their support. But also angry responses from people questioning Peter's service record, demanding proof of his disability, suggesting he was gaming the system. "I didn't think it would get this big," Sarah said, and for the first time since the morning, Peter heard uncertainty in her voice. "Some of these comments, they're getting pretty nasty." Peter scrolled through the responses, his jaw tightening with each accusation, each demand that he prove his disability. The same shame he'd felt at Henderson's came flooding back, but now it was magnified by thousands of strangers dissecting his life, his service, his worth as a human being. But there were other comments too, veterans from different branches of service expressing solidarity, a Marine who'd served in Iraq sharing his own struggles with PTSD, a Navy corpsman describing how her service dog had saved her life after a training accident left her paralyzed. Person after person stepping forward to say, "I see you, I believe you, you're not alone." As Peter read, one comment stood out from the rest. The username was msantos.usmc, and the profile picture showed a woman in marine dress blues. Staff: "Sergeant Anderson was the finest commanding officer I ever served under. If Margaret Henderson knew half of what this Marine sacrificed for his country, she'd be honored to welcome him and his service dog into her store. Semper Fi, sir. Your Marines haven't forgotten." Peter stared at the comment, reading it 3 times before the name fully registered. Maria Santos, his former second-in-command, the Marine who'd pulled him from the wreckage after the IED, who'd held his hand during the medical evacuation, who'd promised him that his Marines would never forget their CO. Sarah was watching him read, her expression shifting from anxiety to something approaching awe. "Dad, who's Santos USMC?" Peter's hand trembled slightly as he handed back the phone. "That's Staff Sergeant Santos. She served under me in Afghanistan." The notification sound chimed again, then again. More comments from usernames that Peter recognized. Marines from his unit, scattered across the country, but somehow finding each other in the digital battlefield of Sarah's viral video. Like a roll call across time and distance, his Marines were checking in, letting him know they were still with him. Sarah's eyes widened as she read the new comments. "Dad, I think your old unit is organizing something. Look at this. They're talking about coming here, to Millbrook." Peter felt the world shift beneath his feet. In one afternoon, his private humiliation had become a public cause, and now the Marines he'd led into battle were preparing to stand with him once again. He wasn't sure if he felt grateful or terrified. Probably both. The phone rang at 07:30 the next morning, pulling Peter from another restless night. He recognized the number on the caller ID, area code 619 San Diego, but couldn't place it until he heard the voice on the other end. "Good morning, sir. This is Staff Sergeant Santos." Even 5 years later, even through the distortion of a phone connection, Maria Santos's voice carried the same crisp authority that had made her one of the finest Marines Peter had ever commanded. But there was something else there now. Warmth, concern, the tone of someone who had seen the viral video and understood exactly what it meant. "Maria," Peter's voice came out rougher than he intended. I saw your comment last night." "Sir, with respect, that comment barely scratched the surface of what I wanted to say." There was steel in her voice now, the same edge she'd used when dressing down recruits who couldn't keep up with her standards. "What happened to you at that store is unacceptable. We don't leave Marines behind in combat, and we sure as hell don't leave them behind in civilian life." Peter closed, his eyes leaning back against his kitchen counter. Through the window, he could see Ranger in the backyard, nose to the ground, following some scent trail with the same methodical precision he brought to everything else. "Maria, you don't need to—" "Actually, sir, I do." Santos cut him off, with the confidence of someone who had spent the last 5 years working in veteran advocacy, learning to fight battles with paperwork and policy instead of weapons. "I work for the Veterans Community Living Center in San Diego now. Legal advocacy mostly, and what happened to you yesterday was a clear violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act." She was already in full operational mode, Peter realized. Santos had always been like this. Once she identified a mission, she pursued it with single-minded determination until the objective was achieved. Right now, her objective was helping her former commanding officer, and Peter knew from experience that nothing would stop her. "I've been reaching out to the rest of the unit," she continued. "Chen's driving up from San Jose. He runs a tech startup now, if you can believe that. Patterson's flying in from Denver. Even Kowalski's coming, and you know how he feels about travel." Peter felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. These names, these Marines who had served under him in the dusty mountains of Afghanistan, who had bled and sweated and nearly died alongside him, they were real. They were coming. They remembered. "Maria, you don't all need to—" "Sir, permission to speak freely." The formal request made Peter smile despite everything. "You spent 3 tours making sure we all came home alive. You took shrapnel that was meant for Martinez and Johnson. You've got 2 Marines buried at Arlington because you put their safety above your own. So with all due respect, shut up and let us return the favor." Before Peter could respond, there was a knock at his front door. Through the window he could see a woman with a professional demeanor and kind eyes, holding what appeared to be a folder of documents. Ranger barked once, his alert bark, not aggressive but informative. "Maria, I need to go. Someone's here." "Roger that, sir, but this conversation isn't over. We'll be there by tomorrow evening." Peter hung up and made his way to the front. Ducked her, Ranger falling into position beside him. The woman on his porch was middle-aged, with the kind of calm confidence that suggested medical training. Her car in the driveway bore veterinary clinic decals. "Mr. Anderson, I'm Dr. Lisa Park. I saw your daughter's video online." She held up the folder. I brought some information I thought you might find useful." Peter studied her face, looking for signs of the judgment or pity he'd grown accustomed to seeing. Instead, he found only professional concern and what might have been anger on his behalf. "I'm a veterinarian here in Millbrook," Dr. Park continued, "but I also do advocacy work for disability rights, particularly around service animals. What happened to you yesterday was illegal, pure and simple." She opened the folder, revealing printed copies of federal statutes, state regulations, and legal precedents. The Americans with Disabilities Act is very clear about this. Service dogs are not pets, they're medical equipment. Banning Ranger from that store is the legal equivalent of banning someone's wheelchair or oxygen tank. Peter invited her in, and over coffee at his kitchen table, Dr. Park walked him through his rights with the patience of someone who had clearly done this before. She explained the legal definitions, the penalties for violations, the process for filing complaints. But more importantly, she explained what Peter could do right now, today, to ensure this never happened to another veteran in Millbrook. "The problem isn't just Margaret Henderson," Dr. Park said, her tone matter-of-fact. "It's education. Most business owners genuinely don't understand the law around service animals. They think they're being responsible by enforcing blanket no-pets policies, not realizing they're breaking federal law." As she spoke, Peter found himself thinking about leadership, about the difference between commanding and influencing. In the Marines, he'd had clear authority, defined chain of command, explicit rules of engagement. But this was different. This required a different kind of courage. The courage to stand up not just for himself, but for every veteran and disabled person who might face the same discrimination. "What would you need from me?" he asked. Dr. Park smiled. "Just your willingness to help educate the community, maybe speak at a town hall meeting, share your story in a constructive way, help people understand that service dogs aren't a convenience, they're a necessity." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a news van in Peter's driveway. Through the window, he could see a reporter setting up equipment, preparing for what looked like a live broadcast. Dr. Park followed his gaze and sighed. "That would be Marcus Williams from Channel 7. He called me this morning, asking for comment on your daughter's video. He seems genuinely interested in covering this as a civil rights issue rather than just sensational content." Peter felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the aversion to publicity that had been drilled into him by years of military training. But before the anxiety could take hold, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from a number he didn't recognize, but the message was unmistakably military in its brevity. "Saw the video. Flying in tomorrow. Semper Fi. Chen." Then another, "On my way from Portland. Time to show these civilians how Marines take care of their own. Kowalski." And another, "Boss, save some fight for the rest of us. See you soon. Patterson." Each message felt like a piece of his old life clicking back into place. These Marines, scattered across the country, pursuing their own civilian dreams and battling their own demons, had dropped everything to come support him. The brotherhood he thought he'd lost when he left the service was still there, still strong, still ready to answer the call. Dr. Park watched him read the messages, and her expression softened. "You're not alone in this, Mr. Anderson, and after tomorrow, neither will any other veteran in this community." Outside, Marcus Williams was adjusting his microphone, preparing to tell Peter's story to a wider audience. Inside, Peter's phone kept buzzing with messages from Marines he hadn't spoken to in years, but who still considered him family. For the first time since yesterday's humiliation at Henderson's grocery, Peter began to believe that something good might come from this after all. By mid-morning, Henderson's grocery had become the unlikely epicenter of a digital firestorm. Margaret. Henderson stood behind the customer service counter, watching her store's parking lot through the plate glass windows as news vans arrived and reporters set up their equipment. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since 6 a.m., some calls supportive, others decidedly less so. "Mom, we need to talk." Brandon Henderson approached the counter with a printout in his hands, his expression more serious than Margaret had seen in months. At 24, her son usually deferred to her experience in running the family business, but today there was something different in his posture, a resolve that reminded her uncomfortably of his grandfather. "Not now, Brandon. Can't you see I'm dealing with a crisis? That's exactly why we need to talk now." He placed the printout on the counter, pages of federal statutes, legal precedents, penalty structures. "I spent all night researching this. We're not just wrong, we're illegally wrong." Margaret glanced at the documents, her jaw tightening. "Where did you get these?" "The internet. Same place that video is spreading like wildfire." Brandon's voice carried a frustration that had been building for months. "Do you know what the fine is for violating the ADA? Up to $75,000 for a first offense, and that's just the civil penalty. We could face a lawsuit, bad publicity, boycotts." "We're already facing bad publicity," Margaret snapped, gesturing toward the parking lot. "That girl put us on blast to the entire internet without even trying to resolve this privately, because there was nothing to resolve." The words came out louder than Brandon intended, causing several customers to turn and stare. He lowered his voice but maintained his intensity. "Mom, the man has a service dog. A trained, certified service dog that helps him with his disability. We had no right to turn him away." Margaret felt heat rising in her cheeks. In the 40 years she'd been part of this business, first helping her father, then her husband, now running it herself, she'd prided herself on making the tough decisions, on maintaining standards, even when it was unpopular. But this felt different. This felt like the ground shifting beneath her feet. "I was protecting our customers," she said, but even to her own ears, the words sounded hollow. From what? A trained service animal that's better behaved than half. "The kids who come in here?" Brandon shook his head. "Mom, I've watched that video a dozen times. That dog never made a sound, never moved away from the veteran's side, never did anything except exist. And we threw them out for that." The bell above the door chimed, and both Hendersons looked up to see Mrs. Chen entering with her usual Tuesday shopping list. The elderly woman had been a customer for over 20 years, one of the steadfast supporters who had kept the store afloat when the big chain supermarkets started moving into the area. But today her usual warm greeting was absent. "Mrs. Chen," Margaret began, but the older woman held up a hand. "I saw the video," Mrs. Chen said simply. "My grandson Tommy served with that Marine in Afghanistan. He says Mr. Anderson saved his life." Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Tommy Chen, he's your grandson. He's driving up from San Jose today. Says he needs to support his commanding officer." Mrs. Chen's voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had lived through enough history to recognize injustice when she saw it. "That young man gave 3 years of his life to keep us safe. The least we can do is let him buy groceries with his service dog." The condemnation hurt more because it came without anger, delivered in the same tone Mrs. Chen used to discuss the weather or comment on produce quality. Margaret watched the elderly woman select her items with methodical precision, each movement a small judgment on the store's treatment of a veteran. As Mrs. Chen left, Brandon cleared his throat. "There's something else, Mom. I've been getting calls this morning. Other business owners in town asking what our policy is on service animals. Apparently most of them aren't sure either." Margaret looked at her son, really looked at him. When had he grown into someone who could research federal law overnight and stand up to her with such conviction? When had he developed this moral certainty that made her feel small and defensive? "What are you suggesting? That we fix this before it gets worse?" Brandon pulled out his phone, showing her the view counts on Sarah Anderson's video. "It's not going away, Mom. And every hour we wait to respond makes us look more like villains." The phone rang again, and Margaret answered with growing reluctance. This time, it was Deputy Sheriff Rosa Martinez, her voice professionally neutral, but carrying an undertone of warning. "Margaret, we need to discuss the situation developing around your store. I've got reports of people planning to protest, counter-protest, and generally turn your parking lot into a circus. We need to get ahead of this." Through the window, Margaret could see more vehicles arriving. Not just news crews now, but cars, with military bumper stickers, veterans organization decals, disability rights symbols. The small coastal town of Millbrook was about to become a battleground, and Henderson's grocery was ground zero. "What do you recommend?" Margaret asked. "Honestly, fix the problem that started this. Make it right with the veteran and his service. A dog, because if you don't, this is going to escalate beyond anything any of us can control." After hanging up, Margaret stood in silence, watching her life's work become the center of a controversy she'd never intended to create. The store that had been her family's legacy for 3 generations was now synonymous with discrimination against veterans. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her own brother had served 2 tours in Vietnam before coming home broken and bitter, struggling with demons he'd never named before taking his own life 6 months ago. Maybe that was the real reason she'd reacted so strongly to Peter Anderson and his service dog. Maybe seeing that quiet dignity, that controlled struggle with invisible wounds, had reminded her too much of David in his final years. Maybe she'd been protecting herself from confronting her own guilt over not doing enough to help her brother. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Mom?" Brandon's voice was gentler now, understanding something had shifted in her expression. "What do you want to do?" Margaret looked at the federal statute still spread across the counter, then at the growing crowd outside, then at her son, who was waiting for her to be the leader he needed her to be. "Get me Peter Anderson's phone number," she said quietly, "and call an emergency staff meeting for this afternoon. If we're going to fix this, we're going to do it right." Outside, the first protesters were arriving, veterans and their families, carrying signs supporting Peter Anderson and demanding justice for all disabled Americans. But Margaret Henderson was no longer watching them with fear or resentment. For the first time since this crisis began, she was thinking like a problem solver instead of a victim. The storm was still gathering, but maybe, just maybe, they could find a way through it that honored everyone involved. The silver Honda Civic pulled into Peter's driveway at 3:47 p.m., and he knew without looking that Elena had made the 4-hour drive from Sacramento in record time. Through the kitchen window, he watched his ex-wife sit motionless behind the wheel. For a long moment, gathering herself the way she always did before difficult conversations. Even after 5 years of divorce, he could read her body language like a familiar book. Sarah emerged from the house before Eleanor had fully stepped out of the car, and Peter felt his chest tighten as he watched mother and daughter embrace. There was desperation in the way Elena held Sarah, as if she could somehow protect her from the media storm that had engulfed their family in the span of 2 days. "I came as soon as I saw the news," Elena was saying as they walked toward the house. "Sarah, honey, are you okay? Have these reporters been bothering you?" "I'm fine, Mom, really." Sarah's voice carried the patient tone she'd developed over the years when reassuring anxious adults. "It's Dad who got hurt by all this." Elena stopped walking when she saw Peter framed in the doorway, Ranger at his side. For a moment, the Years collapsed, and they were just Elena and Peter again, the young nurse and the Marine sergeant who'd fallen in love over shared shifts at the base hospital, who'd built dreams of a quiet life together after his service ended. But those dreams lay shattered in the space between them now, casualties of PTSD and sleepless nights, and the slow erosion of a marriage under the weight of invisible wounds. "Hello, Peter? Elena?" He stepped aside to let her enter, noting how she automatically reached down to acknowledge Ranger. She'd never resented the service dog, understanding from her medical background exactly why Peter needed him. "Thank you for coming." They gathered in the living room, awkward at first, like diplomats from warring nations attempting to negotiate a peace treaty. Elena took the chair she'd always preferred, the one by the window where she could see the ocean in the distance. Sarah curled up on the couch, and Peter took his usual spot in the recliner that accommodated his damaged leg. "Tell me what really happened," Elena said, and Peter found himself recounting the Henderson's grocery incident for the 4th time in 2 days. But this telling was different, more honest, more raw. Elena had seen him at his worst during their marriage, had held him through countless nightmares, had learned to recognize the signs of his deteriorating mental state. She didn't need the sanitized version. When he finished, Elena was quiet for a long moment. "You should have called me," she said finally. "The moment this started escalating, you should have called." "Why?" The question came out sharper than Peter intended. "So you could watch me fall apart again? So you could feel guilty about not being there to clean up the mess?" The words hung in the air, like smoke from an old fire. And Sarah looked between her parents with an expression that was far too knowing for someone her age. She'd lived through the deterioration of their marriage, had watched love corrode under the pressure of trauma and pride, and the inability to ask for help when it was desperately needed. Eleanor's voice remained steady, professional, the tone she used in the emergency room when dealing with difficult patients. "Because despite everything that happened between us, you're still the father of my daughter and the man I shared 15 years of my life with. Because when someone attacks you, they attack the family we built together." "The family we built," Peter repeated, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. "The family you left when things got too hard." "That's not fair." Elena's composure cracked slightly. "You know that's not why I left." "Then why?" Sarah's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Why did you really leave, Mom? And don't give me the same explanation you've been giving me for 5 years about growing apart and different life goals. I'm 21 years old. I can handle the truth." Elena looked at her daughter, then at Peter, then at her hands folded in her lap. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I was killing him." The words fell into silence, like stones into still water, creating ripples that touched every corner of the room. Peter started to protest, but Elena held up a hand. "Let me finish, please." She took a shaky breath. "Your father came home from Afghanistan carrying wounds that went deeper than the shrapnel in his leg. He was drowning in guilt and nightmares and survivor's syndrome. And instead of getting him the help he needed, I tried to fix him myself. I tried to love him better." Elena's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back for years. "But you can't love someone out of PTSD, Sarah. You can't kiss away survivor's guilt or make nightmares disappear with enough patience and understanding. And the harder I tried, the more he withdrew, because he could see what it was doing to me." Peter's hands were gripping the arms of his recliner so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Ranger, sensing his distress, moved closer and placed his head on Peter's knee. "I wasn't sleeping," Elena continued. "I was losing weight, making mistakes at work, snapping at you when you were just a kid trying to understand why her father couldn't get out of bed some days. I was becoming a ghost of myself, and Peter could see it. He started pushing me away to protect me from his pain, and I let him. Sarah's face was streaked with tears now. So you just gave up? I saved myself, Elena said simply. And in doing so, I probably saved him too, because as long as I was there trying to carry his burden for him, he didn't have to face it himself. He could focus on protecting me from his darkness instead of actually dealing with it. The silence stretched between them until Peter finally spoke. I never blamed you for leaving. Yes, you did. You still do. Elena's voice was gentle but firm. And maybe that's fair. Maybe I was weak for not staying and fighting it out. But I looked at my daughter, who was 16 years old, and already showing signs of anxiety from living in a house full of unspoken trauma, and I made a choice. She turned to Sarah. I chose to get you out of that environment so you could grow up healthy and strong, and I chose to give your father the space he needed to either heal or destroy himself without taking us down with him. Peter felt something shift inside his chest, a knot of resentment he'd carried for 5 years beginning to loosen. I got Ranger 6 months after you left. I know. Sarah told me. Elena smiled through her tears. And look at you now. You found a way to manage your PTSD, to build a life that works for you. You raised an incredible daughter who's brave, enough to fight for what's right. You did what I couldn't help you do when I was here. The rumble of a motorcycle engine in the driveway interrupted the moment. Through the window, they could see a man dismounting from a Harley, his leather vest displaying Marine Corps patches and his gait carrying the unmistakable bearing of a career soldier. That'll be Patterson, Peter said, standing up with difficulty. He always did have perfect timing for dramatic entrances. Elena watched him move toward the door, noting how Ranger automatically adjusted his position to provide support. Peter? He turned back to her, and for the first time in years, there was no anger in his expression when he looked at her. I'm proud of what you've built here, she said, and I'm proud of the man you've become, even if I couldn't be part of the journey. Outside, Frank Bulldog Patterson was unloading a duffel bag and scanning the media circus that had descended on the quiet neighborhood. Inside, a family that had been broken by war and trauma was taking its first tentative steps toward healing. The Marines were arriving one by one, but they weren't the only reinforcements Peter Anderson had found. Frank Bulldog Patterson hadn't changed much in 5 years. Still built like a brick wall, still loud enough to wake the dead, and still capable of lighting up a room with his infectious grin. He swept Peter into a bear hug that lifted him clean off his feet, ignoring the careful way Peter had been moving to accommodate his injured leg. "There's my CEO!" Patterson boomed, his voice carrying the kind of joy that came from reuniting with family. "Damn, boss, you look good. Civilian life's been treating you right." "Easy, Bulldog," Peter managed, but he was smiling despite himself. Patterson had always possessed this gift for making everyone around him feel better, even in the worst circumstances. During their deployment, his relentless optimism had carried them through sandstorms and firefights and the soul-crushing boredom of endless patrols. Behind Patterson, more vehicles were arriving. A sleek Tesla with California plates. That would be Tommy Chen, who'd apparently done well for himself in the tech world. A battered pickup truck with Colorado tags, Kowalski, who'd written that. He was driving straight through from Denver. By evening, Peter's modest living room had been transformed into an impromptu command post, filled with Marines who hadn't seen each other in years, but slipped back into old patterns of camaraderie, as if no time had passed at all. "Chen, you corporate sellout," Patterson was saying, examining Tommy's expensive car with mock disapproval. "Remember when you used to get excited about MREs and clean socks?" Tommy Chen, now 28, and carrying the confident bearing of a successful entrepreneur, laughed as he pulled his laptop bag from the Tesla. "The money's nice, but I'd trade it all for one more patrol with you idiots." His expression grew serious as he turned to Peter. "Sir, I can't believe what happened to you. It's exactly the kind of thing my grandmother warned me about." "Mrs. Chen knows about this?" Peter asked. "She was at Henderson's this morning, apparently gave the owner quite the talking to." Tommy grinned. "Grandmother doesn't get angry often, but when she does, people notice. She told me the whole story when I called to let her know I was coming up." As the evening progressed, each Marine shared their post-service story. Kowalski had become a forest ranger in Colorado, finding peace in the wilderness after years of urban combat. Rodriguez, who'd arrived just as the sun was setting, was working as a firefighter in Phoenix, still running toward danger, just in a different uniform. Each transition had been different, each path marked by its own struggles and victories. "You know what the worst part was?" Rodriguez was saying, nursing a beer that Elena had provided from Peter's nearly empty refrigerator. "Coming home and having people thank me for my service, then treat me like I was broken, like the uniform made me some kind of victim instead of a warrior. Or having them assume you're either a hero or a head case," Kowalski added. "No middle ground. No recognition that maybe we're just people who did a job and came home changed by it." Peter found himself opening up in a way he hadn't in years, talking about the isolation of small-town life, the challenge of building an identity beyond his military service, the daily battle with survivor's guilt that Ranger helped him manage but couldn't cure. These men understood in a way that civilian therapists and well-meaning friends never could. "The thing about that store incident," Peter said, "wasn't just the discrimination. It was feeling like everything I'd sacrificed, everything we all sacrificed, didn't matter to these people. Like my service was just some abstract concept they could thank me for on Veterans Day and ignore the rest of the year." Maria Santos, who had driven up from San Diego and arrived just as dinner was being improvised from whatever Peter had in his kitchen, nodded grimly. "That's why I got into advocacy work. Too many veterans dealing with exactly this kind of ignorance, but most of them don't have daughters who know how to make videos go viral." "Speaking of which," Tommy said, pulling out his laptop, "has anyone seen the latest numbers on Sarah's video? It's approaching 500,000 views, and it's been picked up by military blogs, disability rights organizations, and major news outlets." Sarah, who had been quietly observing the reunion from the kitchen doorway, stepped forward. "I've been tracking the response. There are copycat videos now, other veterans sharing their own discrimination stories. It's becoming a movement." The room fell quiet as Tommy pulled up social media feeds showing dozens of similar videos. A Navy veteran with a service dog refused entry to a restaurant in Ohio. An Army sergeant's wife denied boarding on a commercial flight because of her PTSD alert dog. A Marine corporal asked to leave a movie theater because his mobility service dog was disruptive. "Jesus," Patterson breathed, "how many of us are dealing with this shit?" "More than you'd think," Maria said. "The legal protections exist, but enforcement is inconsistent and education is almost non-existent. Most business owners genuinely don't understand the law, and most veterans don't know their rights well enough to fight back." Eleanor, who had been listening from the kitchen while preparing coffee, joined the group. "As a nurse, I can tell you the medical community struggles with this too. I've seen doctors' offices try to ban service dogs. Hospitals question whether psychiatric service animals are real medical equipment. The ignorance goes deep." Mrs. Chen arrived just as full darkness settled over Millbrook, carrying enough homemade food to feed a small army. At 72, Tommy's grandmother moved with the deliberate grace of someone who had lived through enough history to understand the weight of moments like this. "Marines," she said simply, surveying the group with approval. "Good to see you. Taking care of your own." She set down containers of dumplings, stir-fried vegetables and soup that filled the house with the scent of ginger and garlic. As the Marines gathered around the impromptu feast, Mrs. Chen pulled Peter aside. "You know," she said quietly, "my late husband fought in Korea. When he came home, people called it the Forgotten War. Said the veterans didn't deserve parades because they didn't win decisively enough." Her eyes, sharp with intelligence and memory, fixed on Peter's face. "He spent 40 years proving his worth to people who should have been thanking him. Don't make the same mistake." "What do you mean?" "Stop trying to be invisible. Stop apologizing for needing help. These Marines came here because they love you, because you earned their respect in combat. The community needs to see that. Needs to understand what real leadership looks like." As the evening wound down, the Marines began planning their next moves. Patterson would coordinate with local media to ensure Peter's story was told accurately. Rodriguez would research legal options for addressing the discrimination. Tommy would use his tech connections to amplify the story through digital channels. But it was Maria Santos who proposed the most significant action. "Sir, we should organize a demonstration at Henderson's grocery. Peaceful, respectful, but visible. Show the community that Marines stand together, that discrimination against one of us is discrimination against all of us." Peter looked around at these warriors who had dropped everything to support him, at his daughter who had started this movement with courage and conviction, at his ex-wife who had driven 4 hours to stand with him despite their complicated history. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. "All right," he said finally. "Let's show Millbrook what Semper Fi really means." Outside, the media encampment was settling in for a long siege. But inside Peter Anderson's house, the real battle plans were being drawn up by people who understood that some fights were worth having and some principles were worth defending, no matter the cost. The morning mist clung to the coastal hills as Peter's convoy assembled in the parking lot of Millbrook Community Park at 800 hours. 6 Marines, 1 ex-wife, 1 daughter, 1 service dog, and enough media attention to make a Pentagon press. Secretary nervous. Peter sat in his truck, watching his former unit check their gear with the same methodical precision they'd once used for combat patrols. Patterson had organized everything with his typical attention to detail. American flags distributed to anyone who wanted one. Clear guidelines about maintaining peaceful conduct. Designated media liaisons to ensure the message stayed focused. Even Tommy Chen's grandmother had arrived, bringing reinforcements in the form of other Millbrook residents who had known and respected her family for decades. "Remember," Maria Santos addressed the group, her voice carrying the authority that had made her one of the finest NCOs Peter had ever known. "This is about education, not confrontation. We're here to support Staff Sergeant Anderson and to help this community understand what service and sacrifice really mean." Sarah stood near the group's edge, filming everything with her phone. The original video had now crossed 1 million views, and her follow-up content had been picked up by national news outlets. What had started as a daughter's angry response to her father's humiliation had become a rallying cry for veteran and disability rights across the country. "Dad," she said quietly as they prepared to move out, "you ready for this?" Peter looked at Ranger, who sat at perfect attention despite the chaos around them. The dog's calm presence reminded him of something Mrs. Chen had said the night before about not apologizing for needing help. For 3 years, he'd made himself small in this community, trying not to take up too much space, trying not to be a burden. Today, that ended. "Yeah," he said, "I think I am." The march to Henderson's grocery took 15 minutes, but it felt like a parade route. Residents lined the sidewalks, some supportive, others curious, a few openly hostile. Peter recognized faces from around town, the librarian who'd always been kind to him, the gas station attendant who knew his coffee order, the postal worker who made sure packages were delivered safely even when Peter wasn't home. Deputy Sheriff Rosa Martinez had cordoned off part of Henderson's parking lot to maintain order, but her expression suggested she understood the historical significance of what was happening. As a National Guard veteran herself, she knew that some demonstrations were about more than immediate grievances. They were about fundamental questions of dignity and belonging. Margaret Henderson stood behind the plate-glass windows of her store, watching the group approach. Peter could see the tension in her posture, the way she gripped the edge of the customer service counter. Brandon Henderson stood beside his mother, but his body language suggested he was there to support his father rather than oppose the demonstration. The Marines formed a loose semicircle in front of the store, their positioning professional but non-threatening. Patterson held an American flag that had flown over their base in Afghanistan. Rodriguez carried a banner reading, "Veterans deserve respect." Tommy Chen had brought a tablet displaying the text of the Americans with Disabilities Act, prepared to educate anyone who would listen. "Staff Sergeant Anderson," Maria Santos called out formally, "would you like to address the community?" This was the moment Peter had been dreading and preparing for in equal measure. Public speaking had never been his strength. He was a Marine who led by example rather than rhetoric. But as he looked at the faces surrounding him, his Marines, his daughter, the community members who had come to witness this confrontation, he realized this wasn't about oratory. This was about truth. 3 days ago, Peter began, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air, I tried to buy groceries with my service dog. I was turned away because the store owner didn't understand that Ranger isn't a pet. He's medical equipment. He helps me manage PTSD and mobility issues that stem from my service to this country. He paused, looking directly at Margaret Henderson, through the store windows. I'm not here to destroy anyone's business or reputation. I'm here because what happened to me happens to veterans and disabled Americans every day. And it's wrong. It's not just wrong. It's illegal. Dr. Lisa Park, who had arrived with a folder full of educational materials, stepped forward. The Americans with Disabilities Act is clear about service animals, she said, addressing both the crowd and the store owners. They're not pets. They're trained medical aides that provide essential services to people with disabilities. Refusing entry to a service dog is the same as refusing entry to someone with a wheelchair or oxygen tank. Margaret Henderson's resolve appeared to crack. She emerged from the store slowly, Brandon beside her, facing the assembled crowd with obvious reluctance. Up close, Peter could see that she'd been crying. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her usual composed demeanor replaced by something approaching vulnerability. I need to say something, Margaret announced, her voice barely audible over the murmur of the crowd. Mr. Anderson, I owe you an apology. What I did was wrong, and I'm sorry. The crowd quieted, sensing that something significant was happening. Margaret took a shaky breath before continuing. My brother David was a Vietnam veteran. He struggled with problems similar to yours. And instead of helping him, instead of trying to understand what he was going through, I avoided him. I was afraid of his pain, afraid of not knowing what to say or do. Her voice broke slightly. David took his own life 6 months ago. And when I saw you with your service dog, it reminded me of all the times I failed him. So I failed you too, because it was easier than confronting my own guilt. The admission hung in the air like morning fog, transforming the confrontation into something deeper and more complex. This wasn't just about service dog regulations or civil rights violations. It was about a community's relationship with its veterans, about the invisible wounds that war creates, not just in those who serve, but in those who love them. Peter felt something shift inside his chest. The anger that had driven him here, the sense of injustice that had fueled Sarah's viral video, began to transform into something else. Understanding. Margaret Henderson wasn't a villain. She was another casualty of war, another person struggling to make sense of trauma and loss. "Mrs. Henderson," Peter said quietly, stepping closer to the store entrance. "Grief makes us do things that don't reflect who we really are. I understand that better than most." Behind him, his Marines maintained their formation, but the tension had changed. This was no longer a battle. It was the beginning of something that looked remarkably like healing. Marcus Williams, the news reporter, lowered his microphone slightly, recognizing that some moments were too sacred for immediate broadcast. Even the camera crews seemed to sense that they were witnessing something profound, the moment when a community began to reckon with its own wounds. The confrontation Peter had dreaded was becoming the conversation Millbrook desperately needed. The community center had seen better days. Its linoleum floors bore the scuffs of countless town meetings, and the fluorescent lights hummed with the persistence of old age. But at 3 o'clock that afternoon, it hosted the most important gathering Millbrook had witnessed in decades. Margaret Henderson had requested the private meeting after the morning's demonstration, and now 24 people sat in a circle of folding chairs, preparing to have the conversation their community had been avoiding for years. Margaret sat directly, across from Peter, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The confident businesswoman who had run Henderson's grocery with iron-fisted efficiency was gone, replaced by someone who looked fragile and uncertain. Brandon sat beside his mother, providing silent support while clearly struggling with his own emotions. "I want to start," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper, "by telling you about David." She pulled a photograph from her purse, a young man in army fatigues, grinning broadly at the camera with the kind of confidence that only comes before war changes everything. This was taken right before he shipped out to Vietnam in 1969. He was 22 years old, full of plans for when he came home. He was going to marry his high school sweetheart, take over Dad's hardware store, maybe run for town council someday. Dr. Lisa Park leaned forward slightly, recognizing the pattern she'd seen in countless families dealing with veteran trauma. What happened when he came back? He didn't come back, not really. Margaret's voice grew steadier as she found her rhythm. The body came home, but David was gone. He'd wake up screaming, couldn't hold a job, started drinking. Too much. His fiancée left him after 6 months. Dad gave him work at the hardware store, but customers complained that he was strange and unpredictable. Elena, who had positioned herself between Peter and Sarah, nodded with the recognition of someone who had lived through similar experiences. Did he get help? There wasn't help, not like there is now. Margaret's laugh was bitter. This was 1970. PTSD didn't even have a name yet. The VA told him to tough it out and get over it. The community expected him to just adjust, be grateful he'd survived when so many others hadn't. Maria Santos exchanged glances with Peter, both of them recognizing the all-too-familiar story. "How long did he struggle?" 53 years, Margaret said simply. 53 years of jobs he couldn't keep, relationships that fell apart, family gatherings where everyone walked on eggshells around him. And through it all, I was ashamed of him. Ashamed that my war hero brother had become the town. Drunk, the guy people crossed the street to avoid. The silence that followed was heavy with recognition and regret. Mrs. Chen, who had quietly taken a seat near the back, spoke with the wisdom of someone who had lived through multiple generations of American wars. "My husband came home from Korea with similar wounds," she said. "The difference was our community expected suffering. In Chinese culture, we understand that war damages the spirit as well as the body. But here, in America, You expect your heroes to be whole and perfect. You don't know what to do with broken warriors. Dr. Park opened her folder, pulling out printed materials that she'd prepared for moments like this. Mrs. Henderson, what you're describing is secondary trauma, the impact that PTSD has on families and communities. It's real, it's documented, and it explains why you might have unconsciously associated Mr. Anderson's service dog with painful memories of your brother. But that doesn't excuse what I did, Margaret said firmly. Mr. Anderson, you came into my store with a legal right to be there, with a service animal that helps you function in daily life, and I threw you out because of my own unresolved issues. That's not just wrong, it's cruel. Peter shifted in his chair, Ranger automatically adjusting position to provide better support for his damaged leg. Mrs. Henderson, I spent 3 years after my discharge trying to pretend I didn't need help. I was so afraid of being seen as broken that I nearly destroyed my marriage and my relationship with my daughter. Pride and fear make us do things that hurt the people we care about. Tell me about Ranger, Margaret said suddenly. Help me understand what I was really trying to keep out of my store. For the next 20 minutes, Peter and Dr. Park took turns explaining the realities of service dog training and deployment. How Ranger had been specifically trained to recognize the signs of Peter's PTSD episodes and provide grounding through physical contact. How the dog could sense when Peter's anxiety was spiking and guide him to quieter spaces. How Ranger's presence allowed Peter to function independently in situations that might otherwise trigger panic attacks. He's not a comfort animal or an emotional support pet, Dr. Park emphasized. He's a medical device with 4 legs and a heartbeat. Banning him from public spaces is like banning someone's insulin pump or pacemaker. Tommy Chen, who had been quietly taking notes on his tablet, looked up from his screen. The legal penalties for ADA violations can be severe, but that's not really the point. The point is that every veteran who gets turned away from a business, every disabled person who faces discrimination, loses a little more faith in the society they served or the community they're part of. Brandon Henderson spoke for the first time since the meeting began. What can we do to make this right, not just for Mr. Anderson, but for other veterans and disabled people who might face the same problems? Maria Santos smiled, recognizing the question she'd been hoping someone would ask. Education, training, policy changes that go beyond just following the law to actually creating a welcoming environment for people with disabilities. I want to do more than just apologize, Margaret said, her voice growing stronger. I want Henderson's Grocery to become a model for how businesses should treat veterans and people with disabilities. I want other business owners to learn from my mistakes instead of repeating them. Dr. Park's eyes lit up. We could organize a community-wide training program, invite representatives from veteran organizations, disability rights groups, service, dog training programs. Make Millbrook a demonstration community for inclusive business practices. Elena leaned forward. And we need to address the mental health support systems in this community. If David had received proper care 50 years ago, if there had been understanding and resources available, maybe his story would have ended differently. Maybe, Margaret agreed, but we can't change the past. We can only commit to doing better in the future. Peter looked around the circle at faces that had transformed over the course of 2 hours. The anger and defensiveness that had marked the morning's confrontation had given way to something more valuable, genuine understanding. These weren't enemies anymore. They were neighbors working together to solve a problem that affected everyone. Mrs. Henderson, he said finally, I accept your apology, and I'd like to help with whatever training programs you want to implement. Not because you owe me anything, but because this conversation needs to happen in every community across the country. As the meeting wound down, commitments were made and plans were set in motion. Henderson's Grocery would become the first business in Millbrook to undergo comprehensive accessibility and veteran sensitivity training. The community center would host monthly forums on veteran and disability issues. Dr. Park would coordinate with regional organizations to bring educational resources to the area. But perhaps most importantly, Margaret Henderson had taken the first step toward healing wounds that had festered for more than 50 years. Her brother David's story would finally serve a purpose beyond tragedy. It would become a lesson in how communities could do better by their veterans. Outside, the media crews were packing up their equipment, sensing that the crisis phase of the story had passed. Inside, a small coastal town was beginning the harder work of transformation, one conversation at a time. 2 weeks later, Henderson's Grocery had transformed into something resembling a community nerve center. The renovations had been swift and purposeful. A new automatic door system that could accommodate wheelchairs and mobility devices, wider aisles with lower shelving for better accessibility, and most visibly, a dedicated community room where Margaret Henderson had begun hosting what she called coffee and conversation sessions every Tuesday morning. Peter adjusted his position in the circle of chairs, Ranger settling beside him with the practiced ease of a dog who had become something of a local celebrity. Around them sat a dozen other veterans from Millbrook and the surrounding communities, men and women spanning 4 different conflicts, each carrying their own collection of visible and invisible wounds. "The thing about coming home," said Jerry Walsh, a Vietnam veteran who'd driven down from Eureka, "is that nobody prepares you for how loud silence can be." The group nodded with collective understanding. This was the 4th meeting of what had officially been designated the Millbrook Veterans Support Circle, though everyone simply called it Peter's Group. The name had stuck despite Peter's protests that this was a community effort, not his personal project. Margaret Henderson appeared in the doorway with a fresh pot of coffee and homemade cookies, her Tuesday morning ritual that had evolved organically from guilt to genuine care. "How's everyone doing in here?" she asked, her voice carrying none of the nervous uncertainty that had marked her early interactions with the group. "We're good, Mrs. H," called out Corporal Rita Stevens, a Iraq war veteran who'd lost her left arm to an IED. "Tommy was just telling us about his new job interview." Tommy Ramirez, a young Marine who'd served in Afghanistan's final deployment, shifted uncomfortably. "It's not a big deal, just a security position at the community college." "It is a big deal," Peter said firmly, using the tone that had once motivated Marines through impossible situations. "First real interview since you got out, right? That takes courage." The transformation in Peter over the past 2 weeks had been remarkable to witness. The isolated veteran who'd once struggled to buy groceries without triggering panic attacks was now confidently leading discussions about post-traumatic growth, employment challenges, and the complex process of rebuilding identity outside the military structure. Dr. Lisa Park, who attended every meeting as both professional consultant and community member, made notes on her tablet while observing the group dynamics. The healing happening in this room was organic and powerful, veterans helping veterans in ways that formal therapy often couldn't match. "Peter," she said during a break in conversation, "have you given any more thought to the regional conference invitation?" The California Veterans Advocacy Coalition had extended an invitation for Peter to speak at their annual conference in San Francisco, sharing Millbrook's story as a model for community-based veteran support. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who'd been too anxious to defend himself in a grocery store was now being asked to address hundreds of advocates and policymakers. "I'm still thinking about it," Peter admitted. "Public speaking was never my strong suit." You speak to us just fine, Rita pointed out, and this group has grown from 6 people to 15 in 2 weeks. Word's getting around that something special is happening here. Through the community room's windows, Peter could see the changes that had rippled outward from that confrontational morning 3 weeks ago. The florist shop across the street now displayed a veteran's welcome sign in its window. The hardware store had installed a wheelchair-accessible entrance without being required to do so. Even the local diner had added a section to their menu featuring comfort foods from different military bases around the world. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, carrying her own coffee cup and wearing the volunteer coordinator badge that Margaret had insisted she accept. The decision to extend her temporary stay in Millbrook had surprised everyone, including Elena herself, but her nursing background and natural organizational skills had made her invaluable in coordinating the various community initiatives that had grown from the initial crisis. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, "but Brandon wanted me to let you know that the accessibility consultant will be here Thursday to evaluate the rest of the shopping center. 3 more businesses have signed up for the certification program." The certification program had been Brandon Henderson's idea, a voluntary initiative that would recognize businesses that went above and beyond legal requirements to create truly welcoming environments for veterans and people with disabilities. Local media coverage had attracted attention from other communities, and inquiries were coming in from as far away as Oregon and Nevada. Also, Elena continued, Sarah called from school. Her media studies professor wants to use her original video as a case study in digital activism. She's pretty excited about it. Sarah had returned to UC Santa Barbara the previous week, but her involvement in the movement she'd started continued through social media coordination and academic analysis. Her follow-up videos documenting Millbrook's transformation had garnered nearly as much attention as the original, and she'd been approached by several advocacy organizations about internship opportunities. The morning session continued with its usual mix of practical support and emotional processing. Jerry Walsh talked about his struggles with VA bureaucracy. Rita Stevens shared her frustration with dating as a visibly disabled veteran. Tommy Ramirez admitted his anxiety about civilian job interviews, and the group brainstormed strategies for translating military experience into civilian-friendly language. "The key," said Frank Patterson, who'd extended his visit to Millbrook indefinitely after falling in love with the coastal community, "is remembering that our military service taught us skills that civilian employers desperately need. Leadership, problem-solving, working under pressure, mission accomplishment. We just need to learn how to package it properly." Patterson had become the group's unofficial career counselor, using his own successful transition to help other veterans navigate the civilian job market. His enthusiastic personality and genuine care for his fellow Marines had made him popular throughout the community, and rumors were circulating that he was considering a permanent move to Millbrook. As the formal meeting concluded, smaller conversations continued around the refreshment table. Margaret Henderson lingered, clearly wanting to say something but unsure how to approach it. "Mrs. Henderson?" Peter prompted gently. "Everything okay?" "I had a call yesterday," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of pride and nervousness, "from the California Association of Independent Grocers. They want to feature our accessibility initiatives in their next quarterly newsletter, and they're asking if we'd be willing to host other store owners who want to learn about inclusive business practices." The magnitude of what had grown from one discriminatory incident continued to amaze everyone involved. What had begun as Sarah's angry TikTok video had evolved into a genuine movement, touching lives and changing policies far beyond the borders of their small coastal town. "That's incredible," Eleanor said. "David would be so proud of what you've built in his memory." Margaret's eyes misted slightly at the mention of her brother. The memorial garden she'd planted behind the store, dedicated to local veterans who'd struggled with post-service challenges, had become an unexpected gathering place for reflection and healing. David's name was engraved on the central stone, alongside a quote he'd written in a letter home from Vietnam: "War changes you, but it doesn't have to destroy you." "There's something else," Margaret continued. "Brandon and I have been talking, and we'd like to establish a scholarship fund for children of veterans who want to pursue education in communications, advocacy, or social work. We want to call it the Sarah Anderson Scholarship for Digital Advocacy." The suggestion caught Peter off guard, and he felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Margaret, that's incredibly generous. But Sarah would insist that it be broader than just her name. "How about the Millbrook Veterans Family Scholarship?" Elena suggested, recognizing that military service affects entire families, not just those who wear the uniform. As the afternoon wore on, plans continued to evolve and expand. Dr. Park proposed a partnership with the Regional Medical Center to provide specialized training for healthcare workers treating veterans. Tommy Chen, who'd driven up from San Jose for the meeting, suggested creating a digital platform to connect veteran support groups across Northern California. But perhaps the most significant development came from an unexpected source. Deputy Sheriff Rosa Martinez arrived during the cleanup, carrying official-looking documents and wearing an expression that mixed professional duty with personal satisfaction. "Peter," she said, "I thought you'd like to know that the State Attorney General's office has decided to use the Henderson's grocery incident as the basis for a statewide education campaign about service animal rights. They're calling it Operation Welcome Home, and they want you to serve on the advisory committee." The irony was complete. The veteran who'd been too traumatized to defend himself against illegal discrimination was now being asked to help shape policy for an entire state. Peter looked around at the faces surrounding him: his ex-wife, who'd become his closest collaborator, his Marines who'd traveled across the country to stand with him, the business owner who'd become an unlikely ally, the community members who transformed their initial curiosity into genuine commitment. "I guess I'd better practice my public speaking skills," he said finally, and the laughter that filled the community room carried the sound of genuine joy. Outside, the afternoon fog was beginning to roll in from the Pacific, but inside Henderson's groceries community room, the future was looking brighter than anyone had dared to imagine. 6 months had transformed Millbrook into something none of them could have imagined on that foggy Tuesday morning when Peter Anderson was refused entry to Henderson's grocery. Now, on a crisp November day, with the Pacific stretching endlessly, toward the horizon, the same community that had once made him feel invisible was preparing to honor him in ways that still made him uncomfortable. Peter stood in his bedroom, struggling with the tie that Elena had insisted he wear for the Veterans Day ceremony. Through his window, he could see the preparations underway in Millbrook's Central Park, a stage decorated with red, white, and blue bunting, folding chairs arranged in neat rows, and a banner that read, "Millbrook honors those who served." What made this ceremony different from the perfunctory acknowledgements of previous years was the genuine understanding that now underpinned it. "Dad, you look great," Sarah said from the doorway, having driven down from Santa Barbara for the weekend. College had changed her in subtle ways. She carried herself with more confidence, spoke with the authority of someone who'd discovered her calling, and wore a small pin on her jacket that read Digital Advocacy Coalition. Her media studies. Professor had indeed used her original TikTok video as a case study, but more importantly, Sarah had used the experience to launch a broader initiative, helping marginalized communities tell their stories through social media. "I still can't believe they want me to speak," Peter muttered, finally conquering the tie with Ranger's patient supervision. 6 months ago, I couldn't even argue with a grocery store owner. That's exactly why your words matter, Elena said, appearing beside Sarah with the kind of comfortable familiarity that had redeveloped between them over the past months. Their relationship remained complicated, too much history and pain to simply reset to their marriage, but too much love and shared experience to remain distant. They were navigating something new, something that honored their past while acknowledging the growth they'd both undergone. Besides, Elena continued, you're not speaking to argue with anyone today. You're speaking to celebrate what this community has become. The numbers supported her optimism. Henderson's Grocery had become the first business in California to receive the state's new Veteran and Disability Inclusive Certification, a program that had grown directly from Peter's experience. 18 other businesses in Millbrook had followed suit, making their small coastal town a model that was being studied by communities across the country. The Tuesday Morning Veterans Support Group now had a waiting list, with similar groups forming in 5 neighboring towns, but statistics couldn't capture the more personal transformations that had occurred. Margaret Henderson had become one of the most effective advocates for veteran services on the Central Coast, her combination of business acumen and deep personal understanding making her a powerful voice for change. Brandon Henderson had left the grocery business to pursue a degree in social work, inspired by what he'd witnessed in his own community. Dr. Lisa Park had expanded her practice to include specialized services for veterans with service animals, and her research on community-based support models was being published in national journals. Time to go, Sarah announced, checking her phone. The ceremony starts in 30 minutes, and you know how Patterson gets when people are late to formations. Frank Patterson had indeed made Millbrook his permanent home, purchasing a small house near the harbor and establishing himself as the unofficial coordinator of veteran activities throughout the region. His infectious enthusiasm and natural leadership had made him indispensable to the community, and his romantic relationship with Dr. Park had surprised exactly no one who'd watched them work together over the past months. The walk to the park took them through the heart of Millbrook's transformed business district. The changes weren't dramatic. A ramp here, a wider doorway there, signs in multiple languages including military terminology, but their cumulative effect was profound. This was a community that had learned to see beyond its own assumptions, to recognize that inclusion required intention and effort. "Staff Sergeant Anderson," Tommy Chen called out from near the stage where he was helping set up audio equipment. His grandmother's influence had helped him secure a position with a Millbrook tech startup, and his weekly commute from San Jose had evolved into full-time residency. "Sound check in 5 minutes, sir." The gathering crowd represented the full spectrum of Millbrook's evolution. There were the long-time residents who'd lived through the community's gradual awakening to veteran issues, military families who'd moved to the area specifically because of its reputation for supporting service, members, advocates and researchers who'd come to study what was being called the Millbrook model, and scattered throughout were the faces that had become most precious to Peter, his Marines, his family, the unlikely allies who'd emerged from conflict. Mrs. Chen sat in the front row, wearing a jacket decorated with pins commemorating her husband's Korean War service and her grandson's Afghanistan deployment. Beside her sat Jerry Walsh, the Vietnam veteran who'd driven down from Eureka and decided to relocate permanently after finding the kind of community support he'd been seeking for decades. Rita Stevens occupied the aisle seat, her service dog Bella wearing a vest that matched Ranger's, both animals alert but relaxed in an environment they'd helped create. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mayor Patricia Fernandez announced from the podium, "please welcome our keynote speaker, Staff Sergeant Peter Anderson, United States Marine Corps." The applause that greeted Peter as he approached the microphone was unlike anything he'd experienced in civilian life. It wasn't the polite acknowledgement that veterans typically received at public events, nor the uncomfortable pity that sometimes accompanied recognition of his service-connected disabilities. This was genuine appreciation from a community that had come to understand what service meant and what it cost. Peter looked out at the assembled faces, finding courage in their familiarity. Ranger sat at his feet, providing the steady presence that made everything else possible. Elena and Sarah occupied seats in the second row, their expressions mixing pride with the kind of love that had survived trauma and transformation. His Marines were scattered throughout the crowd, their presence a reminder that some bonds transcended time and distance. 6 months ago, Peter began, his voice carrying clearly across the park, I thought my service to this country was behind me. I believed that my job was to fade quietly into civilian life, to take up as little space as possible, to not burden anyone with the complications that came with my invisible wounds. He paused, watching recognition dawn on faces throughout. The crowd, many of them had felt the same way. Veterans and military families who'd learned to make themselves small, to apologize for their needs, to accept discrimination as the price of belonging. I was wrong, Peter continued, not about the wounds, those are real and they're permanent, but about what service means. I thought it ended when I took off the uniform. I thought it was something I used to do rather than something I am. Margaret Henderson dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, thinking of her brother David, and all the years he'd struggled with the same misconceptions. The memorial garden behind her store had become a pilgrimage site for veterans and families dealing with loss, and David's story had become part of the healing narrative that defined Millbrook's transformation. This community taught me that. Service doesn't end with military discharge, Peter said. It evolves. It becomes about using your experience to help others, about standing up not just for yourself, but for everyone who shares your struggles. It becomes about building bridges instead of walls, about choosing understanding over ignorance, about turning pain into purpose. He gestured toward the crowd, encompassing the full scope of what they'd built together. The young Marine who created a viral video to defend her father's dignity, the business owner who chose education over defensiveness when confronted with her mistakes, the community members who decided to do better once they understood the impact of their choices, the advocates who turned a local incident into a movement for national change. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she listened to her father articulate the journey they'd all traveled together. Her original TikTok video now seemed like ancient history, a crude beginning to something far more sophisticated and meaningful. The scholarship program established in her name had already helped 6 young people pursue careers in advocacy and communications, and the digital platform she'd helped develop was connecting veteran communities across 3 states. But mostly, Peter continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, this community taught me that coming home isn't something that happens to you. It's something you create. Home isn't just a place where people know your name. It's a place where they understand your story, where they're willing to learn from your experiences, where they see your struggles as opportunities for collective growth rather than individual problems to be hidden away. The silence that followed was complete, broken only by the distant sound of waves against the harbor rocks and the gentle flutter of flags in the coastal breeze. Then Rita Stevens began to clap, and the applause spread through the crowd like wildfire, carrying with it months of shared effort and mutual respect. As Peter stepped back from the podium, Maria Santos rose from her seat and began what every Marine in the crowd recognized as a slow, ceremonial salute. One by one, his former unit members joined her, followed by veterans from other branches and conflicts, then by family members and community supporters who understood that some moments transcended traditional boundaries. The ceremony continued, with presentations and recognition for various community initiatives, but Peter found himself thinking about the phone call he'd received that morning from the Department of Veterans Affairs. They wanted to partner with Millbrook to create a national training program for community-based veteran support, using their model to help other towns and cities build similar inclusive environments. "You did it, boss," Patterson said, as the formal proceedings concluded and people began to mingle around displays showcasing the community's various programs. "You found your post-service mission." Peter watched Elena deep in conversation with Dr. Park about expanding mental health services for military families. He saw Sarah interviewing Mrs. Chen for a documentary she was creating about intergenerational military service. He observed Margaret Henderson explaining accessibility modifications to business owners from neighboring communities who'd driven down to learn from Millbrook's example. "We did it," Peter corrected, understanding finally that leadership wasn't about individual achievement, but about empowering others to exceed their own expectations. "And we're just getting started." See you, as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the Pacific, casting long shadows across the park where his community had chosen to celebrate rather than simply remember, Peter Anderson felt something he hadn't experienced since before the IED explosion that had changed everything. He felt like he was exactly where he belonged. Ranger stirred beside him, sensing the shift in his human's emotional state, and Peter reached down to stroke the dog's head. "What do you think, boy? Ready to see what happens next?" The German shepherd's tail wagged once, measured, confident, ready for whatever mission came next. Around them, the community they'd helped transform continued its work of becoming something better than it had been, one conversation and one relationship at a time. Home, Peter realized, wasn't something you found or something you lost. It was something you built with the help of people who chose to see your struggles as their opportunities to grow. And for the first time in years, he was eager to see what tomorrow would bring. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.